Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. To briefly introduce our speaker today, Stella has been a prominent figure in the international community, tirelessly campaigning for the protection of whistleblowers, journalists, and truth seekers around the world. Her journey into the world of press freedom advocacy was profoundly influenced by her involvement with her work with the case against Julian Assange, whose work at WikiLeaks in exposing the government secrets and championing transparency ignited a global debate on the delicate balance between national security and public interest. Her involvement in the global press rights movement has brought her into the forefront of many international discussions where she's passionately argued for the importance of press freedom as a cornerstone for democracy. In her role as an advocate for press rights, she has shed light on the plight of journalists and activists who face persecution and imprisonment for their courageous work. If you all join me in welcoming our guest tonight.
Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Julian was here in 2011, which is actually the first time, well, in the first days that I actually met Julian. I was sitting here, and he was giving an address to the Union. And he was again here in 2015. The first time he was here in 2011, he was under house arrest, and in 2015 he was actually a political asylee in the Ecuadorian embassy, and he was doing it remotely via video link. And today he is completely silenced, and I think it's useful to think about that progression over time, first under house arrest, then as a political asylee, and today as a prisoner in Belmarsh High Security Prison in southeast London, where he has been since the 11th of April 2019, the day he was arrested, and the day it was revealed that the United States had an extradition warrant against him, which had been issued in December 2017. I also want you to go into this talk considering the framework being the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 19 of that declaration, which is from 1948, and all of you will know, came out of the catastrophe that was the Second World War. It was a framework of consensus of the international community, and it said, everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. Think about that. Seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. Now, WikiLeaks fragmented the old axiom that history is written by the victors. Just like the Gutenberg press had done in 1440, there's a progression of how the press has democratized information. From the start, WikiLeaks was dedicated to transparency and democratic accountability as a means of influencing governments, governmental action, and empowering citizens, and seeking reform through transparency. Transparency was the method. The goal was justice. And what was the method? To give whistleblowers the opportunity from around the world to untraceably and securely provide information of fraud, abuse, illegality, human rights violations. And that they did. Once WikiLeaks provided the platform, the whistleblowers stepped forward. The effectiveness of the WikiLeaks model proved itself again and again and again. And it's worth going through a few of these publications because often when WikiLeaks and Julian's work is talked about, it is from a kind of meta perspective. The concrete revelations what WikiLeaks has achieved, what it has revealed, is often not part of the discussion. The first is the Trafigura publication. In 2008, WikiLeaks published a report that exposed the actions of a chemical company called Trafigura. In 2006, 2 years earlier, Trafigura, which was a multinational commodity trading company, had chartered a ship called the Probo Koala to transport toxic waste generated during the cleaning of oil cargo tanks. Instead of disposing of the toxic waste in a proper manner, the company decided to offload it in various locations in and around Abidjan, which is the largest city in the Ivory Coast. The toxic waste, containing hazardous mixtures of petrochemical slops, led to a severe public health crisis in the Ivory Coast. At least 17 people died and thousands sought medical treatment. But this is only part of the story. When newspapers like The Guardian tried to report on this, Trafigura managed to effectively silence that reporting. Trafigura used a series of injunctions to suppress the story. It was only when WikiLeaks published the report that it reversed the suppression of the story and made the world aware of the environmental and health crisis that was unfolding. Prior to 2010, and I'll tell you why 2010 is kind of a turning point, there was also a very impactful publication, a couple of very impactful publications about Kenya. There was a publication revealing hundreds of extrajudicial assassinations that had taken place in Kenya. Julian actually went to Kenya and was working from there. And WikiLeaks also published a report by the intelligence company Kroll about corruption. And this intelligence report that was published ultimately led to a defeat of the government at the elections that year. So we're in 2009, and I should mention that Julian won the Amnesty International New Media Prize for these publications about extrajudicial assassinations in Kenya that year. So that year, in 2009, this is the way that WikiLeaks described itself on its website: a multi-jurisdictional organization to protect internal dissidents, whistleblowers, journalists, and bloggers who face legal or other threats related to publishing. Our primary interest is in exposing oppressive regimes in Asia, the former Soviet bloc, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the Middle East, but we are of assistance to people of all nations who wish to reveal unethical behavior in their governments and corporations. We aim for maximum political impact. We believe that transparency in government activities leads to reduced corruption, better government, and stronger democracies. All governments can benefit from increased scrutiny by the world community, as well as their own people. We believe this scrutiny requires information. So WikiLeaks introduced two or three new innovations in journalism. And for you to understand the context, WikiLeaks was established in 2006. And Julian's background is as a cryptographer. He was a part of a movement called the cypherpunks. And he understood the problem that, let's say, mainstream journalists were not aware of. He understood the architecture of the internet. He understood how easy it was to surveil information as it was transmitted through the internet, and also understood the role that cryptography could play to assist in providing whistleblowers, journalistic sources, with an anonymity. And once you could guarantee anonymity for sources, then information would flow more easily into journalism. He also added an additional layer, and this comes from Julian's background as a student of physics and mathematics in Melbourne University, And so he's from a science background, he's a cryptographer, and so he kind of looked at journalism through a scientific lens, and he wanted, and not just wanted, but modeled WikiLeaks off what he called scientific journalism. So what is scientific journalism? Well, he describes it in a New Yorker interview from 2010. This is the way he talked about it. If you publish a paper on DNA, you're required by all the good biological journals to submit the data that has informed your research. The idea being that people will replicate it, check it, verify it. So this is something that needs to be done for journalism as well. There is an immediate power imbalance in that readers are unable to verify what they're being told, and that leads to abuse. So the WikiLeaks model of scientific journalism was an innovation. It provided the data on which the analysis was based. WikiLeaks publishes analysis. This is not often talked about. A lot of the kind of very superficial description of WikiLeaks is that it just publishes data, but actually it publishes analysis alongside the data. But WikiLeaks places a lot of value in the data, and I'll go into why there is value in archives in a little while. But the whole point was it made the journalist that was reporting accountable. And this was a really important and challenging innovation for the journalistic community at the time. The journalistic community, just as basically many of you are a lot younger than me. In fact, I was thinking about it, and I was thinking, wow, when Julian was arrested, many of you would have been 13 years old, and that was just 4.5 years ago. And I've been involved in this case since 2011. So I need to adjust my framework with this in mind. But at the time, so I'm from a generation that lived the world before the internet and then saw the transition. And WikiLeaks is really a product of this transition. And if you look at things like the invention of Bitcoin, it's no coincidence that this happened more or less at the same time, and came more or less from the same community. They were both cypherpunks, Satoshi Nakamoto and Julian Assange, and it kind of follows a similar trajectory, and the problems that they're trying to solve are very similar. But it has to do with the coming of age of the internet and the way that archives were starting to be digitized in the mid to late 2000s. And so you had these government, like these public offices who had all this paperwork, archives, and then why shouldn't they be digitized? And once they're digitized, why shouldn't the public have access to them? And so there was a movement for transparency, for access, and WikiLeaks came out of that movement. And then that was paired with a environment of the post 9/11 world in which a state of exception was introduced with regards to torture and all sorts of things, black sites and so on. These things were introduced as kind of, well, the world's a bit different, and we need secrecy, and we're going to invade these countries, and you don't have access to that kind of information. So WikiLeaks emerges in that context, in a context of transparency and in a context of subversion of long-held principles and democratic safeguards and so on that were being undermined because of the war on terror. So WikiLeaks started getting some very high-value sources in this context. And as I said, many of them came from like Kenya and Peru and China, but very soon WikiLeaks also started getting some sources from within the United States and within the context of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so in 2010, WikiLeaks, actually 2009, WikiLeaks received information from a source, which we now know that source was Chelsea Manning. And Chelsea Manning at the time was an intelligence officer stationed in Baghdad, and her job was to analyze the databases from her army base, and she had access to, I think, top secret or maybe above top secret information. None of the information she sent to WikiLeaks was top secret, but she sent 5 sets of data about the Iraq War. It's called the Iraq War Logs, which were published in October 2010. I should probably do this in chronological order, but I'll leave the first one till last. The first one was the Afghan War Logs, published in July 2010. And like the Iraq War Logs, which were published in October 2010, this was the most detailed archive of a war that had ever been published. It was the day-to-day events, the day-to-day explosions and people maimed and killed, and where it happened and who it happened to and their ages and so on. The Afghan and Iraq war logs really revealed the inner life of a war. And of course, we're all acutely aware of the fog of war and the way that the information around what's actually happening is obscured or confounded, and as a impartial observer, it's very, very hard to understand what's happening. And this had happened over the period since the start of the Iraq War in 2003 and the Afghan War in 2011, I think. Basically, the information about those wars had been managed and sanitized, and the way that those wars were being reported was, at least for Western journalists, they were often embedded journalists, which meant that you lived and moved around Baghdad or wherever it was with the troops, with the British or US or whatever troops that were fighting those wars. And then you would go to a press briefing by the Pentagon officials who had all the information and who then imparted that information to a room like this full of journalists who then reported what was said. So WikiLeaks' publication of the internal records of the Pentagon, of the State Department about these wars created a real departure. It basically the public had grown bored, uninterested, and distanced itself from what was occurring in these wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And the information was sanitized through the Pentagon and so on. And then WikiLeaks, together with The Guardian, the New York Times, El País, Le Monde, and Der Spiegel, formed a coalition in order to basically mine these documents, because there were huge data sets, and try to give a story to this data and research it and understand what actually happened. Events like, a bombing in a village where hundreds of people died and everyone was listed as a combatant. As far as the Pentagon briefing would have was concerned, that was an event where only combatants were killed. But if you look at the data, you think, well, this is unlikely, maybe it should be looked into. So I'll go into a little bit more of what these 5 individual publications were in a bit. But just broadly speaking, it was the Iraq War Logs, the Afghan War Diaries, the US State Department cables, the detainee assessment briefs from Guantanamo Bay, and the collateral murder video. And Julian is currently facing 175 years in relation to these very publications in the United States. That's why he's in Belmarsh prison. He's not convicted of anything in this country. He's been there for 4.5 years. It's the highest security prison in the country. And the United States is keeping him there, is refusing bail, opposing bail, because it wants to put him on trial under a very old piece of legislation called the Espionage Act, which has never been used against a publisher before, in relation to these publications that Chelsea Manning leaked to WikiLeaks and that Julian and WikiLeaks then published, and which are of undeniable public interest. There is one of the publications in relation to which Julian is facing a lifetime in prison, which has become iconic in relation to war, in relation to the importance of WikiLeaks. And I want to show that to you today, because it shows WikiLeaks' proof of function, and it remains the most recognizable and significant, I think, single publication about the Iraq War that exists, similar to the Vietnam War, which has this iconic picture of a young girl who is running down a country road naked, burned by napalm. This video about the Iraq War, which is called Collateral Murder, published by WikiLeaks, leaked by Chelsea Manning, is the most iconic image of the Iraq War.
Let me know when you gather. One shoot. Light them all up.
202 traffic, 260.
Come on, fire. Hey, Roger. Keep shoot. Keep shoot.
Bushmaster 2-6. We need to move time now.
All right, we just engaged.
Hey, we need to stop that so we can get down there. We need to straight south. You see my look?
Roger. Break. Crazy Horse 1A, request permission to engage. I'm picking up the wounded. Yeah, we're trying to get permission to engage. Come on, let us shoot. A Bushmaster, Crazy Horse 1A.
Those 2 men are carrying a severely injured
Bushmaster,
journalist
Crazy Horse 1A.
into the van.
It's Bushmaster 7, go ahead.
Roger, we have a black SUV or bongo truck picking up the bodies. Request permission to engage.
Bushmaster 7, Roger. This is Bushmaster 7, Roger, engage.
1-8, engage. Clear. Come on. Clear. Clear. We're engaged. Coming around, clear. Roger. Trying to, Clear. Roger, I lost him in the... I got him. I'm firing.
George, this is Bushmaster 4. You got any BDA on that truck, over?
You're clear. This is Crazy Horse, stand by. I'm shooting for some reason. Go ahead. I think the fan's disabled. Go ahead and shoot it. I got an azimuth limit for some reason. Left.
Okay, so for context, that is 2007. That is Baghdad. And in the beginning, what you see is a group of civilians two Reuters journalists, one carrying a camera, and they're walking around those streets of Baghdad, and what you see is the viewfinder from a US Apache helicopter that is flying above Baghdad, far above, so far that they don't know there's a helicopter up there. And the pilots then start shooting on this group of people and kill them all immediately except for one, who then tries to crawl to safety. Two of the people in that group were Reuters journalists who were on assignment there. They were actually doing a story in that part of Baghdad. That's why they were there. That's why they had the camera. And then one of them, who's the one that's severely injured, tries to crawl behind a wall to seek cover. And then this van pulls up. And the van is driven by a man who's actually taking his two children, to school. And he stops when he sees this severely injured man next to this wall. He opens the van. He tries to carry him into the van. And then you see the people inside the helicopter, and you hear them speaking, and they're saying, do I have permission to engage? And permission to engage is permission to shoot. And he's asking his superior. And of course, this is a war crime, to open fire on these group of people who are clearly there, who are good Samaritans. They just stopped to help this person and tried to bring them to a hospital. That is prohibited by the rules of war, and they then open fire and kill everyone inside, except for the two children, who are only saved because their father threw himself on top of them. They were sitting in the front seats, and he threw his body on top of them, and they were severely injured, but the bullets perforated his body and perforated theirs, but didn't give them. They were rescued eventually when the US military showed up and realized there were two children in the van, and they were taken to a hospital and thankfully survived. So this video is known as Collateral Murder, and I recommend that you watch it in its entirety. It's 38 minutes. There's a shorter version, about 10 minutes, and it's also subtitled. And one of the most chilling things is to look at the subtitles and hear the conversation, because it's really like a video game. They say, haha, good shooting, really chilling things and dehumanizing things. And of course, the Reuters journalists who were on the ground, the only reason why this particular incident has got so much attention, perhaps, is because there were two Reuters journalists there. And Reuters, in fact, tried to access the tape. They knew it was recorded, and the US military refused to hand it over. And they said, well, we've investigated, everything was carried out according to the rules of engagement, i.e. the rules concerning when you can open fire and open fire against a group of people or kill people. And they were able to conceal the war crime because it was not public. And of course, once you have the video, then the war crime cannot be reasoned away. It's either a violation of international law or it isn't. And if it's in conformity with the US rules of engagement, well, those rules of engagement do not conform to the international laws of war. So, the WikiLeaks model privileges the or values the archive and the original source material, because we cannot trust the Pentagon's version of what happened that day. Because once we saw the record of what happened that day, there was a discrepancy, and very severe discrepancy, with what had been told about this incident. So the WikiLeaks model is what Julian has sometimes called the rebel. WikiLeaks provides what he calls the rebel library of Alexandria. In his introduction to the book, The WikiLeaks Files, The World According to the US Empire, Julian wrote the following: "Diplomatic cables are not produced in order to manipulate the public, but are aimed at elements of the rest of the US state apparatus, and are therefore relatively free from the distorting influence of public relations. Reading them is a much more effective way of understanding an institution like the State Department than reading reports by journalists on the public pronouncements of public officials. Only by approaching this corpus holistically, over and above the documentation of each individual abuse, each localized atrocity, does a true human cost of empire heave into view." Now, there are some examples of why the archive is important. It was the archival aspect of WikiLeaks which allowed one of the men who had assassinated the Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi. One of the assassins was a Saudi intelligence official, by the name of Mutreb. He was only able to be identified. One of the elements to identify him came from a publication that WikiLeaks had already published some time back. The documents showed how Mutreb had been trained in using offensive spyware technology on behalf of the Saudi state against journalists and activists. Khashoggi was killed in the Saudi embassy in Istanbul back in 2018, where he was strangled by a 15-man assassination squad, Mutreb being one of them. His body was dismembered inside the embassy, and his remains were never recovered. Another example of how the archival aspect of WikiLeaks has such an important role. The one diplomatic cable that had perhaps the greatest impact of all, diplomatic cables, I should say, started publication in 2010 in conjunction with there were about 100 media organizations. By the end of it, by September 2011, initially the 5 El País, The Guardian, New York Times, Le Monde, and Der Spiegel, but then it was expanded. So they started publishing these diplomatic cables. Diplomatic cables are sent from embassies and other international institutions where the US has representations back to Washington, to the State Department. So they're known as the State Department cables. So there was one that I think was the one with the greatest impact, but it was not discovered by any of these big newspapers. And it was actually published in September 2011. The cable is called, it has an identifier 06 Geneva 763. It was published in September 2011. And it described the execution of an Iraqi family by US troops, including 5 children under the age of 5. This is a quote from the cable. "Troops entered the house and handcuffed all residents and executed all of them. The autopsies revealed that all corpses were shot in the head and handcuffed." So the cable was published just as Iraq's government was in the process of negotiating the possible extension of the status of forces agreement with the United States, which conferred immunity to US troops that was due to expire by December 31st, 2011. And the publication sparked calls for an inquiry by the Iraqi parliament, and soon after, the Iraqi government said it would strip US forces of immunity for civilian killings. The consequence of this, Obama announced US troops would leave Iraq by the time of the deadline, 1 month after the publication of that cable. I'll go through a few of the other publications because I'm aware that we're going to go into a Q&A, and just as an overview. In 2012, WikiLeaks published over 100 classified or otherwise restricted files from the US State Department, Department of Defense, covering the rules and procedures of detainees in US military custody, including the standard operating procedures for Guantanamo Bay. WikiLeaks also published a statement in 2015 from a whistleblower pertaining to the safety of issues concerning UK Trident submarines, nuclear submarines. In 2015, WikiLeaks also released a classified EU documents that outlined a plan to destroy refugee boats in Libya and the Mediterranean. In 2015, the same year, revelations of espionage against the European Commission, European Central Bank, and French industry. In 2016, WikiLeaks published the Yemen Files, a collection of over 500 documents from the US Embassy in Yemen that offered documentary evidence of the US arming, training, and funding of Yemeni forces in the years building up to the war. And also, WikiLeaks had also published about the war in Yemen. In 2017, WikiLeaks published revelations of US spying during the French presidential election campaign. WikiLeaks published drafts of 4 trade agreements, including the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. The drafts of these agreements had been kept secret and withheld from the European Parliament, despite their significance. The contents of those draft agreements led to widespread concern. And more recently, WikiLeaks published materials pertaining to the organization responsible for enacting the family separation policy under the previous administration, which separated children, in the United States, which separated children from their families at the US-Mexico border. Now, just to conclude, probably one of the publications that many of you will have in mind are the 2016 publications in relation to the US Democratic Party. These concerned the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, and the Podesta emails, Podesta being the the campaign manager of Hillary Clinton. So the DNC publication, the Democratic National Committee publication, was published, I think, in June 2016. And what it revealed is how the Hillary Clinton campaign had basically rigged the primaries against the other potential candidate, which was Bernie Sanders. And again, many of you are too young to understand the context. This is the election in which Trump was elected. But the atmosphere, the political context around that election was incredibly populist. And the Democratic Party actually had a populist candidate, Bernie Sanders, and the Republicans had Donald Trump. And the polling before there was a final candidate selected by the Democratic National Committee was that if Bernie Sanders had run against Trump in a context of populism, that Bernie Sanders would have won. And yet, knowing this, knowing the polling and so on, the Democratic National Committee was in cahoots with the Hillary Clinton campaign, partly because of a hole in their budget, which the Hillary Clinton campaign was able to fill. There was even a secret agreement between the Hillary Clinton campaign and the DNC, which Donna Brazile, who later became the president of the DNC, revealed in her book. The emails that WikiLeaks published showed that there was a conspiracy between the DNC and one of the candidates to disadvantage the candidate that was actually polling better, Bernie Sanders. The second leak came in October 2016, the Podesta emails. campaign manager for the Hillary Clinton campaign, and again revealed a lot of details about the way the Hillary Clinton campaign was dealing with the 2016 elections. In this case, how the Clinton campaign, it can be very plausibly argued, rigged the Republican primaries to favor Donald Trump. And this was revealed in an email, well, in several emails, but most clearly laid out in an email that talked about the Pied Piper strategy. So what was the Pied Piper strategy? The Clinton campaign had the calculus of the Clinton campaign was that the American electorate would not elect a populist Republican. It was a complete misread of the climate at the time. And therefore, the Clinton campaign, or the DNC, and their networks should try to give the more extreme candidates of the Republican Party maximum exposure. So how did they do that? And it's detailed in these emails. Well, they contacted their contacts in CNN, MSNBC, etc., and said, put Trump on. Because they thought that if Trump was running against Hillary, then most people would vote for Hillary. And of course, we know what happened. This was a very bad miscalculation, bad reading of the situation, but it was a strategy that was implemented by the Clinton campaign and, by extension, the Democratic National Committee to get Trump the maximum exposure, expecting that to lose votes to the Republican Party, and we know what happened. Just to conclude, so what happened after that? We all know that WikiLeaks was criticized mainly by the Clinton campaign and its media network about these publications, because they were seen to have a massive impact ahead of the elections. And the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, tried to bring a lawsuit against WikiLeaks and Julian. And you probably haven't heard about this, but okay, so what happened? Well, it was brought in New York, and the judge threw it out on First Amendment grounds. And in dismissing the case, the court described the publication of the DNC emails in the following manner: the publication of matters of the highest public concern. The DNC's published internal communications allowed the American electorate to look behind the curtain of one of the two major political parties in the United States during a presidential election. This type of information is plainly of the type entitled to the strongest protection that the First Amendment offers, of the highest public concern, of the highest public interest. And this is one example of the incredible contribution that Julian has personally made to public discourse, to the public interest. And Julian's imprisonment today is not a consequence of a failure on the part of WikiLeaks. It is a consequence of its success, of its impact, of its importance. And it is no coincidence that we are in a free speech and free press crisis today. Because if Julian were not, if we weren't, Julian would not have spent a single day in prison. Julian's imprisonment is a symptom of the dire information environment that we find ourselves in and the censorship climate. And we do not have free speech as long as Julian is not free.